Hi everyone, my name is Maris and welcome to my booktube channel. This is my third or fourth attempt at maintaining a YouTube channel. In the past, I've tried to make vlogs and lifestyle content, but it just hasn't worked out because I think my life is just not interesting enough to vlog or to make videos around. But recently, in the month of September, I recently got back into reading and fallen in love with it again. I was a huge book nerd and bookworm when I was younger, but something happened in high school and college I feel like many of us experience where I just kind of stopped reading. And in college I majored in journalism and policy, so I was constantly doing readings for class and I just didn't have time to pick up a book. So yeah, it's been great getting back into reading and finding what I like and dislike. So today is a very special video because it's my September wrap up. This was the month that I got back into reading and I'm just really excited to talk about the books that I loved and even I didn't like. The first book that I read was Percy Jackson and the Olympians. This was a reread for me. If you guys know me, you know that I love Percy Jackson. I think that the series is chef's kiss all the way. For anyone that doesn't know what the series is about, it's about Percy Jackson and his other demigod friends who are half god and half human. And Percy is the son of Poseidon and he basically just goes on all these adventures with his friends and goes to this summer camp called Camp Half-Blood where he learns how to fight and just learns more about his family history, I guess. I don't even know what you call that. This was a reread. This was the first book that I finished in September and I'm really glad that I started the month off with this because it made me realize how great it feels to really be sucked into a fantasy world. As an adult, I picked up on a lot of innuendos and hidden symbolism that I didn't catch when I was younger, and it's just a great series all around. It's definitely not a book that, even though it's middle grade, I think it's a book that can be read at all ages, especially if you have an appreciation for Greek myths. So I rated this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It is a really great book, really great series, and I can't wait to finish the rest of the series. The next book that I read was Misery by Stephen King, and this book was amazing. I actually picked it up because of one of my favorite booktubers, Noelle Gallagher, and she raves about this book, and I wanted to pick up a thriller because I don't normally read thrillers. Even when I did read a lot, I wanted to pick something up that was a page turner, and this book definitely was. It's my first Stephen King novel, so I was unsure what to expect, but I ended up really liking it. The basic premise centers around this author named Paul Sheldon, who basically gets held captive by his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, and Annie forces him to write the 4th book of a series that he basically ended. He kills off the main character in that series and Annie's really upset and forces him to write the next book. The sensory language, the really descriptive way that Stephen King describes the pain that Paul feels is really captivating, I would say. It's one of those books where I had to cover the next page with my hands so I wouldn't read ahead. It's definitely that kind of a book. Characters are really fleshed out in this book, especially Annie Wilkes, I would say. Her story is really gruesome, and without giving too much away, just really crazy. And I actually watched the movie after I read this book, and the book is definitely better. I would say that it goes into Paul Sheldon's mind more and what it feels like to be addicted to painkillers that Annie gives him and things like that. So I definitely recommend picking up the book. It was a 4.5 read for me and a great thriller if you want something fast and something really, really suspenseful. So I definitely recommend that. The third book that I read was The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. I actually picked this book up also because of Noelle Gallagher. I ended up liking the story, but I didn't love it. I gave it a 3.5 stars. The story centers around Lucy and Josh, who are enemies basically at work. There are 2 book publishing companies merged to form this big one, and they serve as the executive assistants to their respective CEOs, and they're forced to share this space, and it's an enemies to lover trope, so very predictable, I would say. There were definitely a lot of cute moments between the two, and there is some good banter every now and then, but I don't think that those pros like outweigh the cons of what I would say is a pretty toxic relationship. It's obviously like romance novels, like they're gonna depict all kinds of love dynamics, but this one was just especially frustrating because a lot of the issues that these two had could have been solved if they just communicated and talked about their issues with each other. The characters are okay. They're not, the character development that they do experience doesn't feel very natural. I think it's a pretty lackluster story. I gave it 3.5 stars because there are really cute moments, but I think that the problematic tones of the book kind of outweighs the benefits of the story. The next book I read was Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This book was probably the best book that I read in September. Coates writes with such like lyrical mastery, and he writes in such a raw and honest way. So this book is a letter to his son, who's a 15 or 16-year-old black teenager in the United States. So he's growing up in a pretty tumultuous time in American history, and Coates basically writes this like a memoir almost. So he goes through the different segments of his life that he wants to share with his son, so it feels very intimate. The experiences that Coates undergoes and like shares with his son are so powerful, and he writes it in such a lyrical way that you're just hooked onto his words. I actually ended up annotating this book by underlining the lines that I liked. I figured if I used tabs to like highlight these really interesting parts, I would run out of tabs. It was that well written. The way he writes feels like a stream of consciousness, so it's really great because you feel like you're inside his head and you're really experiencing, or you're really understanding and empathizing the things that he goes through. So I would 100% recommend this book. I really do think it should be required reading. On the cover, actually, Toni Morrison writes, "This is required reading." So I totally agree with her. I think that this book should be taught at all levels of schooling. I think that this is definitely going to be the next American classic and will be read for years to come. The next book that I read was No Exit by Taylor Adams. I actually buddy read this with my boyfriend, and it was good to kind of like bounce back with our thoughts. So it follows Darby, this sophomore college student who is basically like driving and hits this like ginormous blizzard on the roads, so she's forced to pull over to a rest stop. So as the snow like rages on, she goes outside to like try to call her mom and her sister. Her mom is dying at a hospital, and she's trying to like get a hold of either of them, and she ends up like looking over at the truck next to her car, and she finds that there is a little girl caged inside a box. So then she goes back in and she realizes that there are 4 people in the rest stop, and then there's 4 cars outside in the parking lot. So she, deduces that it has to be one of them that's kidnapping this girl. The premise of the book and like the atmosphere and setting is super fascinating because it's super claustrophobic. Like, you're forced in this rest stop in a blizzard. My problem with this book though is that it's not a whodunit, and it's marketed as a whodunit. The kidnapper is revealed about 60 pages in, and it turns into a survival thriller, which is still really cool. I just think that it's, I expected a whodunit mystery. I also think that Darby is very self-righteous and was a really annoying character to kind of be like our lead. She does a lot of things that endangers everyone in the rest stop, and also the girl inside the truck, so that was a little bit frustrating for me. Overall, for me, it was a very fast-paced read, but I do think that because of the poor character development and the fact that the stakes just didn't feel very high for me, and I gave this book ultimately a 3.5 stars. The next book I read was Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. This book was amazing. I actually picked it up almost on a whim. I was watching a video by Gabby Reads, and she recommended it, and I went to my Barnes & Noble just to see like what they had, and the book that I initially was looking for was not on the shelves. So I picked up this book instead because I saw it in the young adult section. I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did. The book centers around Aristotle mainly, who is a 15-year-old boy who's coming to terms with his sexuality, his place in his family, his Mexican American identity, and just growing up basically in the 1980s, and he meets this guy Dante who is a lot more confident in himself, and he's also exploring his sexuality. Aristotle is the main character. The way his thoughts are written is very reflective of a young teenage boy's, but it was still very poetic and very lyrical. As you can see, I have so many tabs in this book because I found so many parts just like so captivating, so powerful. I cried multiple times in this book. It's just a really great book that explores a lot of really crucial things, from LGBTQ identity to family dynamics to being like a hyphenated identity in the United States. All of that was explored, and in so much depth, even through the eyes of a teenage boy, and I recommend this book wholeheartedly. I probably will get a tattoo of something from this book at some point in my life because I loved it that much. So this was an easy 5-star read, and probably next to Between the World and Me was the second best book that I read that month. I also read Circe by Madeline Miller, and this book is a classic retelling of Circe's legend in Greek myths. She's a daughter of a sun god, and basically she's exiled to this island and is forced to kind of fend for her own and like learn how to use magic and things like that. This book was not what I expected. It definitely feels like a character study. You follow Circe throughout her life, throughout her many adventures, and it's cool because if you follow Greek mythology, or if you studied it in school, or like just have any fascination with it, it's really awesome to see how many stories that Circe is interwoven in. I found that because I already had that initial like fascination with Greek myths, I ended up liking this story a lot more than a lot of other people. I think the writing is really gorgeous and it feels very classical, if that makes any sense. But I do think that the pacing was a little bit slow for me. I do like things that are either medium or fast-paced, but this was really, really slow. And I ended up thinking that there were many scenes that could have been cut out, but I think that the character development in this book is impeccable. I love how all the women in the book are given such big personalities. I think that's like very lost in Greek myths. The myths often focus on the men, obviously the male heroes and the male gods. A breath of fresh air to the women in Greek myths, and especially Circe. I ended up rooting for her. I love the ending of this book because I felt like it really came full circle, and yeah, it was just a really good read. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I also do want to note that I read the first 3 books of the Harry Potter series. I'm reading this currently like as an adult. I only got up to the 4th book when I read it as when I was younger. I don't really want to go into what I thought about these books because, as you guys know, J.K. Rowling has voiced like pretty problematic messages about the trans community, and I don't want to amplify her work even more. Partially because there are already a cultural phenomenon and, you know, already widely read. So yeah, that's my September wrap up. Those were the 10 books that I read, and I'm really excited for October because I have a lot of like spooky reads on my TBR, and hopefully I will do an October wrap up. And yeah, see you in my next video. Bye!